The Russian Civil War was filled by a variety of factions, all with varying ideologies. Among the most important were the sailors of the Russian Baltic Fleet based in Kronstadt on the island of Kotlin. They were dubbed by Leon Trotsky himself as being the glory and pride of the revolution, and for good reason. Considering their proximity to the capital of Petrograd, the Kronstadt sailors played a pivotal role in the revolution and in the subsequent civil war. During the disturbances dubbed the July Days of 1917, they landed in the capital in support of the workers' protests for power to be transferred to the Soviets. When Lenin declared that the Bolsheviks were to seize power by force, the sailors of Kronstadt were recruited to form the spearhead of the Bolshevik vanguard. During the October Revolution, they were amongst the troops that stormed the Winter Palace and played a pivotal role in defeating the Cossack counterattack that occurred afterwards. With Petrograd and Moscow secured, they were sent to places as far away as Ukraine, the Don, the Kuban, and Orenburg, bringing with them Bolshevik rule. When the Bolsheviks had yet to establish a proper army of their own, the sailors were some of the few units that Lenin could count on. When Petrograd was once again threatened by a white offensive, they were called on to defend the city, saving Petrograd once again from falling into the hands of Lenin's enemies. Despite their loyalty towards the Bolsheviks, the Kronstadt sailors differed quite significantly from them in terms of ideology. They were of anarchist tendencies in stark contrast to the authoritarianism of the Bolsheviks. While it seems weird that they would ally themselves with them in the first place, the most logical conclusion was that they were united against a common enemy, that being the old Tsarist autocracy and those who opposed the revolution. They also could have quite possibly been convinced that the Bolsheviks were fighting for Soviet power, rather than just using the slogan of all power to the Soviets as a means to justify their own takeover. In November 1920, the Red Army had occupied the whole of the Crimea, the last major holdout of white forces in all of Russia. But the fall of the Crimea didn't bring an end to the Civil War. Not only were there groups of white insurgents in the Far East, but also more numerous groups in southern Ukraine, the Caucasus, and in Central Asia. During August 1920, in the Russian heartland, the largest and most organized of the peasant revolts broke out in the region of Tambov, with tens of thousands of people taking up arms against the Bolsheviks. The economic situation of Soviet Russia was one such factor that contributed to mass discontent. The Civil War had ravaged the lands along the Volga River, and thousands of kilometers of railroad tracks had been destroyed. To add to their misfortune, the Bolsheviks requisitioned grain from the peasantry at gunpoint, in many cases leaving them with very little for themselves in a desperate attempt to feed the hungry cities. The result was a cruel famine, characterized by untold acts of cannibalism that claimed the lives of millions. Worst of all for the Bolsheviks was that the cities, the centers of power, were still hungry. Despite the Tambov uprising eventually being quelled by the troops commanded by the young and talented Mikhail Tukhachevsky, incidents like these shook the Bolshevik regime to its core. During the 10th Congress of the Communist Party, Lenin was quoted as saying that worker strikes and peasant rebellions were much more dangerous than any Denikin, Yudenich, and Kolchak combined. So far, 1921 was a terrible year for the peoples of Soviet Russia. In the cities, particularly the northern ones such as Petrograd, hunger was ever so present. The urban proletariat was forced to venture out of the city in search of food as bread rations decreased, cramming onto the few trains that they could catch. However, these expeditions were considered illegal, and the Bolsheviks confiscated whatever the hungry civilians managed to bring back. To make matters worse, the economic situation was so dire that sufficient fuel was impossible to acquire for all of Petrograd's factories, causing many to be forcibly shut down and thousands left without jobs. In response, thousands of workers went on strike in late February, hoping that the government would see reason and reopen the factories. The American anarchist Emma Goldman, who was in Petrograd at the time, recalls the misery of the city's population and the subsequent strikes that ensued. The winter was an exceptionally hard one, and the people of the capital suffered intensely from cold, hunger, and exhaustion. They asked an increase of their food rations, some fuel, and clothing. The complaints of the strikers, ignored by the authorities, presently assumed a political character. Here and there was also voiced a demand for the Constituent Assembly and free trade. The attempted street demonstration of the strikers was suppressed, the government having ordered out the military kursanti. The party boss of the city, the veteran Bolshevik Grigory Zinoviev, responded with violence rather than diplomacy. On Nevsky Avenue and in Vasilevsky, the first clashes between workers and Bolshevik soldiers produced dozens of casualties. The soldiers shot into the crowds, injuring and killing at least 30 people. The use of violence failed to put an end to the protests, and, to make matters worse for the Bolsheviks, thousands of soldiers from the Izmailovsky and Finland regiments mutinied and joined the demonstrators. Many more soldiers straight up refused to open fire, and special detachments from the Cheka had to be deployed, arresting thousands of protesters, notably Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. On February 25th, martial law was declared, and the Bolsheviks began the crackdown. The whole thing had a striking resemblance to the February Revolution that had occurred just 4 years prior. Food shortages, strikes, demonstrations, and mutinies. Russia was seemingly on the brink of another revolution. Aside from repression, the authorities also resorted to softer approaches. The restrictions on trade were abolished, and extra trains were even promised to help the people of Petrograd forage for food in the countryside. Emergency food rations were distributed, and several factories were reopened. For many, this was enough to alleviate the situation, and they ceased their opposition. But not everyone was content. On the 26th of February, the sailors of Kronstadt sent a mission to Petrograd to investigate the ongoing strikes. Upon landing, they came face to face with the harsh reality that Petrograd's population were forced to endure. Their little expedition only served to convince them of their growing disdain towards the Bolsheviks. 2 days later, the crews of the Petropavlovsk and the Sevastopol battleships held an emergency meeting, approving a resolution that had the potential to change the course of Russian history forever. The so-called Petropavlovsk resolution, written by the rebellion's de facto leader, Stepan Petrichenko, laid down 15 points, declaring that the present Soviets do not express the will of the workers and peasants, and, to summarize it, called for freedom of speech and press for workers and peasants, to anarchist and left socialist parties, secure freedom of assembly for trade unions and peasant organizations, to liberate all political prisoners of socialist parties, as well as all workers, peasants, soldiers, and sailors. Abolish all political departments, since no party should be given special privileges in the propagation of its ideas, or receive the financial support of the state for such purposes. And finally, to equalize the rations of all working people. Missing from these demands were calls for the reopening of the Constituent Assembly, which they themselves had helped shut down back in 1918. What they wanted instead was Soviet democracy, with free elections for all the workers and peasants to participate in. The causes of the Kronstadt rebellion were much deeper than simple ideological disagreements and extended far beyond the limits of Petrograd. The majority of the Kronstadt sailors were of peasant background, originating from places such as Ukraine and Tambov. As mentioned, these areas were ravaged by war and rebellion, with Bolshevik rule being rather harsh. When the sailors traveled home to visit their families, they were confronted with the brutality of the Bolsheviks and questioned by their relatives on why they fought for them. More in line with their anarchist tendencies, what the sailors truly wanted was an independent Soviet republic of their own in opposition to a centralized Bolshevik state. Going back a few years, the Bolsheviks purged the Kronstadt Soviet of other socialist parties, much to the fury of the sailors. In 1920, when the Civil War was almost at an end, the veteran Bolshevik Raskolnikov was appointed as commander of the Baltic Fleet and basically ruled Kronstadt as a feudal lord, fitted with fancy clothes and even servants. This last part was essentially a massive middle finger to the sailors, who would jump at the first opportunity they got to rebel. Upon hearing word of the revolt in Kronstadt, the president of the Central Executive Committee, Mikhail Kalinin, ordered the soldiers to stand down and to submit to Bolshevik authority. When they refused, Kalinin interpreted their decision as a declaration of war. However, he did try one last attempt to resolve the rebellion by peaceful means. On the 1st of March, a gathering held at the Anchor Square in Kronstadt, in which 15,000 people, about a third of Kronstadt's population, and even several Bolshevik representatives attended. Another resolution was approved that called for the re-election of the Kronstadt Soviet. Mikhail Kalinin and the Baltic Fleet Commissar tried to calm things down, but were ruthlessly mocked by the angry populace. On March 2nd, Kalinin and some 200 other Bolsheviks were detained by the rebels, and, instead of electing a new Soviet, they elected a Provisional Revolutionary Committee of 15 members, 6 of them being civilians and 9 of them being sailors, headed by Stepan Petrichenko. These actions were taken out of fear caused by rumors that the Bolsheviks were going to disperse the elections for the new Soviet. While these rumors turned out to be false, the Bolsheviks were nonetheless planning to put an end to the rebellion. With no turning back, the rebels of Kronstadt began organizing their defenses and preparing for a siege. The rebels were confident that their example would inspire people from all over Soviet Russia to rise up and force concessions from the Bolshevik government. Having lost the glory and pride of the revolution, the Bolsheviks grasped at whatever they could to smear the image of the Kronstadt sailors. What they came up with was, for the most part, straight-up lies. They claimed that the rebellion was orchestrated by white Russian officers sent by the French government. These accusations were chiefly pointed at a former Tsarist officer named General Kovlovsky as being the head of the mutineers. But the truth is that Kovlowski had nothing to do with the planning of the uprising. He was just a military specialist that Trotsky himself had sent to the island to reorganize the coastal batteries that defended the entrance to Petrograd. Regardless, the blame was put on him, and his 10-year-old daughter was taken as a hostage by the Bolsheviks. Despite these accusations being obvious propaganda, they did have some basis in reality. 2 weeks before the revolt even started, the French press reported on an alleged rebellion that was supposedly on its way in Kronstadt. The historian Jonathan Smele theorizes that this may have been linked to a document drafted by white Russian exiles, notably liberal cadets, that contained precise information about how a revolt in Kronstadt could be supplied for March that year. Why on earth liberals would try to convince anarchists to fight for them is beyond comprehension. Upon hearing news of the Kronstadt rebellion, white Russian exiles couldn't help but feel hope that the Bolsheviks may be overthrown. They started organizing support to send the rebels much-needed supplies. Though nothing came out of this, it gave credit to Bolshevik propaganda and delegitimized the rebellion for many people in Russia. Another way for the Bolsheviks to slander the sailors was to claim that most of the original ones from 1917 were no longer on Kronstadt, having their revolutionary zeal diluted by peasant recruits. However, several decades later, the historian Israel Getzler published data that disproves these claims, stating that 75% of the 1917 sailors had taken up arms against the Bolsheviks. The rebels responded to these accusations of white involvement in their own edition of the Izvestia newspaper. At the head of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee stand elected, selfless martyrs, the best sons of the laboring people, soldiers, sailors, and workers. They will not allow anyone to seat himself on their neck. Much less will they allow Tsar's generals or white guards. The Kronstadt garrison did not surrender to Tsar's admirals and will not surrender to Bolshevik generals. Do not lie and attempt to deceive the people, cowards. You know our strength and our readiness to either be victorious or to die with honor. Trotsky arrived in Petrograd on the 5th of March and appointed his preferred commander, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, to command the Red Army in their inevitable attack. Fearing for the loyalty of their troops, units of supposed unquestionable allegiance were selected to form the vanguard of the attack, which included the Bashkiria Brigade, the Special Counterinsurgency Regiment, and 4 brigades from the 27th Rifle Division. A desperate search for 2,000 white cloaks for the infantry was only able to acquire a bunch of old white blankets. Kronstadt would have to be stormed by literal human waves running across the frozen harbor, thus making those white cloaks very important. The plan was to attack from the north and from the south, where the distance between Kotlin and the mainland was the shortest. But even then, the attacking soldiers would still have to cross over at least 4 kilometers of open ground. On the same day of Trotsky's arrival, he gave one last warning to the rebels. The workers' and peasants' government has decreed that Kronstadt and the mutinous ships must immediately submit to the authority of the Soviet Republic. I therefore order all who have lifted their hands against the socialist fatherland to lay down their arms at once. Those who resist will be disarmed and turned over to the Soviet authorities. The arrested commissars and other representatives of the government must be released forthwith. Only those who surrender unconditionally may count on the mercy of the Soviet Republic. Responsibility for the harm that may consequently be suffered by the peaceful population will fall entirely upon the heads of the counter-revolutionary mutineers. This warning is final. The Kronstadt sailors refused to accept the demands of the Bolsheviks, though they did release some of the prisoners, including Kalinin. The rebels sent a delegation to Petrograd to try and negotiate with the Bolsheviks. However, the Kronstadt delegates were arrested by the Cheka, and they were never seen again alive. Emma Goldman and several others who felt sympathy towards the rebels wrote a letter of appeal to Zinoviev to settle the crisis via peaceful methods. Concerning the conflict between the Soviet government and the workers and sailors, we hold that it must be settled not by force of arms, but by means of camaraderie. Resort to bloodshed on the part of the Soviet government will not in the given situation intimidate or quiet the workers. On the contrary, it will serve only to aggravate matters and will strengthen the bands of the Entente and of internal counter-revolution. Let a commission be selected. The commission is to go to Kronstadt to settle the dispute by peaceful means. In the given situation, this is the most radical method. It will be of international revolutionary significance. This appeal was all but ignored, and the Bolsheviks continued the preparations for the assault on Kronstadt. On the 6th, Mikhail Tukhachevsky finally arrived in Petrograd with units of the 7th Red Army, and the attack would soon commence. A few days prior, the newspapers of Kronstadt addressed the civilians on the upcoming assault. Kronstadt is now enduring a moment of tense struggle for freedom. An attack by the communists can be expected any minute, with the goal of seizing Kronstadt and again fastening us to their authority, which brings us only to hunger, cold, and ruin. We all, to the last man, will staunchly defend the freedom achieved by us. We shall not allow them to seize Kronstadt, and if they should attempt to do so by force of arms, we will give them a worthy repulse. On the 7th, Tukhachevsky gave the order for 10,000 Red Army troops to initiate the assault on Kotlin Island. For the soldiers on the ground, it was a race against time, just as it was a race to find cover. It was feared that the ice would soon melt, making Kronstadt all but impregnable. As a result, the preparations for the attack were insufficient, which was to have dire consequences. The attack was kicked off by an artillery barrage of Bolshevik guns firing from Krasnaya Gorka and from other positions along the coast. First thing in the morning on the following day, Bolshevik troops advanced across the frozen waters under the cover of a snowstorm. But it ended in tragedy. Though iced in and limited in effectiveness, the guns of the Petropavlovsk and the Sevastopol opened fire on the exposed Bolshevik troops and broke holes in the ice, causing unknown numbers of men to drown. When the snowstorm blew away, dead bodies covered the frozen ice. The rebels also responded with their own artillery strikes against the Bolshevik guns in Krasnaya Gorka, inflicting heavy damage. Despite the Bolsheviks employing blocking detachments for the Cheka to gun down their own men if they retreated, dozens of Red Army troops mutinied, notably from 3 regiments of the 27th Rifle Division that had been chosen personally by Tukhachevsky to spearhead the assault. Dozens of these men were subsequently executed. Suffice to say, round 1 had been won by the sailors of Kronstadt. All this couldn't have happened at a worse time for Lenin. The day that Tukhachevsky's assault failed was the same day that the aforementioned 10th Congress of the Communist Party was scheduled to take place in Moscow. Lenin was faced with internal divisions and dissidents that threatened his control over the party. A faction called the Workers' Opposition, with notable members such as Alexander Kollontai and Alexander Shilatnikov, were pressing Lenin on the issues of party democracy and of trade unions, while other party members were proposing a resolution for the crisis in the countryside. It was a moment of panic, with internal divisions threatening to put an end to Lenin's dictatorship, while opposition from the outside literally threatened to bring upon Russia a new revolution. Back in Petrograd, the morale of the Red Army had plummeted. Tukhachevsky launched further, but smaller, assaults on Kotlin, but all these failed. Even though Red forces were now numerically superior to the 16,000 rebels, his soldiers were hesitant to turn their guns on their former comrades, and especially hesitant to charge across several kilometers of ice under fire at the very end of the Russian Civil War. The Red Army then proceeded to bombard Kronstadt from the air, but it appears that the old force was a tough nut to crack as the bombing inflicted little damage. On the 10th, 300 volunteers from the Communist Party, many of them having been attending the 10th Congress, arrived in Petrograd to assist with the suppression of the Kronstadt rebellion. On the 14th, the Kronstadt Izvestia issued a call to the workers and peasants to join them in their rebellion. When the rebellious proletariat demanded the liberation of its brothers who were languishing in the prisons, bloody Trotsky opened fire on Red Kronstadt. Having dressed deceived soldiers in white shrouds, he sent them with rifles in their hands to strangle our truth. But truth is not for Trotsky to strangle. However Trotsky might try to strangle the free idea of Kronstadt, he will soon be forced to dress himself in the same white shroud in which he dressed the unfortunate soldiers whom he deceived and drove out with machine guns to die without glory on the ice at the approaches to Kronstadt. We have decided to be victorious or to die under the ruins of glorious Kronstadt. May we be judged by the workers of the world. We stand firmly at our post. Having raised the banner of liberty, we are certain of victory. While this call may have been enthusiastic and defiant, the truth is that the morale of the Kronstadt rebels was growing lower as the proletariat had yet to join them. The ongoing worker strikes in Petrograd were also coming to an end, either through the arrest of their participants or of light concessions. Similar results were also achieved by the Bolsheviks in other cities, and the likelihood of a third revolution grew ever more distant. Back in Moscow, Lenin started to bring things back under his control. After insulting Kollontai and Shilyapnikov, Lenin managed to convince the attendees in these difficult times that it was necessary for the party to remain united in the face of external threats. On the 16th, a resolution was approved that prohibited the creation of internal factions within the Communist Party, also allowing for their expulsion if sufficient votes were received. This basically gave the Central Committee the same dictatorial powers to rule over the party just as the party ruled over Russia, ending any opposition towards Lenin and later towards Stalin after his takeover. Another significant resolution was the imposition of a grain tax, which would lay down the foundations for the new economic policy. With peasant revolts and famine killing millions and shaking Russia to her core, the forced requisitions of grain were not sustainable, and some compromise had to be reached. The new resolution on party unity that Lenin implemented briefly discussed the Kronstadt rebellion. The fact that the enemies of the proletariat take advantage of all deviations from a strictly consistent communist line was seen most clearly in the example of the Kronstadt uprising. Such instances fully prove that the White Guardists are striving and are able to assume the guise of communists and even to assume positions to the left of communism, if only they can weaken and overthrow the bulwark of the proletarian revolution in Russia. Before the final assault on Kotlin Island was to occur, the Kronstadt Izvestia published its last and ever so optimistic final volume, once again calling for the support of the workers. Break the chains, brothers. The dawn of the Third Revolution is rising. The bright sun of freedom shines here in Kronstadt. The oppressor's power tumbled down like a house of cards, and we, free, are building our revolutionary Soviet. Lend a hand, brothers, and forward for freedom and fortune, for power to the Soviets and not to parties. On the 16th, the final assault on Kronstadt commenced with an artillery and aerial bombardment on the rebels' positions. On the 17th, at 4:50 in the morning, Tukhachevsky gave the order to commence the main assault on the island. Between 25 and 30,000 Red Army soldiers charged across the ice under the cover of fog in a desperate race to reach the island before being gunned down. The ice was thin and covered by a layer of water and snow, looking less white and making the camouflage cloaks of the attackers somewhat redundant. More guns had been brought in from inactive fronts, and the 300 party volunteers took part in the charge, but the effectiveness of these volunteers was dubious, and the bombardment only made things worse for the attackers by breaking holes in the ice. Before reaching the first line of rebel defenses, the fog began to disperse, and hundreds of Red soldiers were killed and thousands injured on the exposed ice. But by midnight, the Red Army had reached the island and captured most of it, including Kronstadt's coastal batteries. Tukhachevsky had initially planned to use poison gas to force out the remaining sailors from their ships. However, he never got the chance to do so, as the sailors of the Petropavlovsk and the Sevastopol ended up overthrowing their own leaders when they learnt of their intentions to scuttle the ships and proceeded to surrender to the Bolsheviks. By the 18th, there were about 3,000 sailors remaining. According to survivors, they fought to the death, saving their last bullet for themselves, though this is arguably an exaggeration. After so many lives had been lost, the sun finally set on the so-called Free Kronstadt. Approximately 9,000 Kronstadt rebels, including Stepan Petrichenko and General Kovlosky, fled across the ice towards Finland. Many of them were injured and lacked proper winter clothes. Patrols of Finnish troops set out to guide the fleeing rebels towards refugee camps where they were accommodated in vacant dachas after being disarmed. Aside from the sailors, there were also many women and children who accompanied them into exile. The situation was rather dire as many of the rebels were in poor health and the American Red Cross had to supply much needed aid. Finland was by no means an idyllic destination, as the survivors were then used as cheap labor for public work projects. But over the course of years, many of them were persuaded by the Soviets to return to Russia under the promise of amnesty, only to be killed or incarcerated upon arrival. The day after the crushing of the rebellion, hundreds of captured rebels were paraded through Petrograd on their way to captivity. That night, 500 of them were executed without trial on orders given by Zinoviev. A few of them managed to escape and sought shelter in the apartment of the Marxist poet Maxim Gorky and told him about the executions. He then ratted out Zinoviev to Lenin, but nothing came out of this, as Lenin had probably approved of the executions. During the following months, another 2,000 rebels were executed under Lenin's orders, most without trial, while those who remained were sent to the Solovki concentration camp, where they died a slow and painful death. The official Soviet report was that 1,000 rebels had been killed, 2,000 wounded, and over 6,000 captured. As for their own, they claimed that a little over 500 of their own troops had been killed and over 3,000 of them wounded. But recently published documents indicate that up to 4,000 rebels were killed, along with at least 2,000 Red Army troops. Hundreds of bodies were not immediately recovered, eventually washing up on the shores of Finland. There were so many of them that the Finnish government had issued a formal complaint to the Russians regarding health concerns. After its conclusion, Emma Goldman wrote of the crushing of the rebellion. On March 17th, the communist government completed its victory over the Kronstadt proletariat, and on the 18th of March, it commemorated the martyrs of the Paris Commune. It was apparent to all who were mute witnesses to the outrage committed by the Bolsheviki that the crime against Kronstadt was far more enormous than the slaughter of the communards in 1871, for it was done in the name of the social revolution, in the name of the Socialist Republic. The crushing of the Kronstadt rebellion had the consequence of disillusioning socialists all over the world with Soviet Russia. Obviously, in their eyes, the Bolsheviks weren't real communists, and little doubt remained that they had become tyrants. The Kronstadt rebellion was by no means the end of the Russian Civil War, as insurgencies continued to harass the Bolsheviks over the course of several years. But it was its last major battle, with thousands of people being killed in proximity to the cradle of the revolution. It was the last serious threat to the establishment of Lenin's dictatorship and had the possibility of kicking off another revolution. Obviously, that didn't happen, and it's probably a good thing it didn't. While the sailors of Kronstadt were certainly brave, I have personal doubts that a bunch of anarchists would do a better job at governing Russia than the Bolsheviks. However, it would have been interesting to see what would have happened had they succeeded. Presumably, in typical Russian fashion, millions of people probably would have died. Anyways, that's the end of this video. If you want to see more stuff like this, then consider subscribing. If you want to help fund the revolution, then you can donate to my Ko-fi page. Anyways, take care and have a good day.
Fun facts. Life isn't fun. Life is a terrible, cold, dark cycle of sadness. But there's one way you can fix that. Go to your local store and buy a beer. Just do it. Drink some alcohol. Why are you scared? What are you gonna do instead? Watch reels? What a joke. Get drunk.